In this video, let's start talking more about configuration validation. So previously we've discussed some amount of how to validate that your configuration changes are correct. Let's dive into that in a little bit more detail. So here I have a playbook. Let's look at what this playbook is doing. So here we see we're operating on the Cisco group. That's going to be PyNet Router 1 and PyNet Router 2. We've defined this variable with two NTP servers. We're going to then just check our connectivity using the iOS Fax core module. So are we able to connect to the devices using the Ansible core modules? And then we go ahead and make a configuration change. We go ahead and configure those two NTP servers that we defined earlier up in our playbook. And then let me just comment out everything after that line. So everything after where we make the configuration changes. Now let's start out by looking at what our current NTP configuration is, at least on one of the Cisco routers. We go ahead and look at this and see what we get back. Okay, so we actually see we currently have those two NTP servers configured. And then if we look at group vars, we can see that those are the same two NTP servers that you would expect. So if I go ahead and run this playbook, we're going to see that our configuration checks out as being valid. Now let's go ahead and modify our group vars, and let's change this to be something else. So I'm going to make a copy of this just so I remember what the name of those NTP servers was. Go ahead and change this, and I'm just going to make NTP1 be 10.10.24, and I'll make NTP2 be this. Now let's go ahead and re-execute our playbook. We're going to now push out these two new NTP servers. And then let's look at netmiko grep to verify our current configuration state. So here in a minute, we're going to see that we actually have 4 NTP servers configured. We have our 2 new NTP servers, and we have our 2 old NTP servers. And this is a bit of a problem. So now let's talk about how we start augmenting our playbook to not only push our configuration changes, but to validate that at the end of it, we only have the things that we want configured. So let me grab these two, because these are the two that I actually want. Go back into group vars. Go ahead and configure these two NTP, or specify these two NTP servers as the following. So now if we re-execute our playbook, we're going to see that Ansible thinks everything is perfectly fine. We're saying configure these two NTP servers. It is saying, yes, those are configured. We haven't put anything extra in there to check that, yes, only configure these two NTP servers and ensure there is nothing else there. So let's go start augmenting our playbook for how do we do this, ensure that there are no other NTP servers configured. So let's look at this next step in our playbook. Okay, so the next thing we do is we run an iOS command, and we actually run this show run include NTP command. It gives us back the NTP servers as a list of, those NTP server commands. So when we do that, we are going to see the equivalent of this. Those are the only NTP server statements referenced in our running config. And we register that output. We save that output to a variable. Now, that just comes back to us as a string. So it comes back to us as a string, and then we have to do some additional processing on that string. Because what we ultimately want to do is, well, it comes back to us as a string in the standard out, and it comes back to us as a list of lines in standard out underscore lines. And what we ultimately want to do is compare the elements here with the elements we specified earlier on in our playbook with what's specified here. And basically we want to ensure that config NTP specified here matches what's configured on the device. So now we have to do some additional processing. And as we've seen earlier in the course, there's multiple ways we can handle this. So the first thing I'm going to do here is grab the standard out lines variable and the 0 element from this NTP servers variable. So if we look at this, here's the variable. So here's our output. We see a set of keys associated with it: changed, invocation, standard out lines. We want to grab this key. Now notice it's a list embedded inside a list. We want this element 0. So we want the standard out lines element 0. So we're going to get this list back. And we're going to save that into this variable NTP servers underscore proc. So processed NTP servers. Now we continue onward and we do some more processing. We take this NTP servers proc and we start piping it through some Jinja 2 filters. So we use the set operations. Remember, this difference filter is doing a set difference. So it's going to compare the set that's configured, and it's going to remove our starting variable. So if these are identical, we'll be left with an empty list. And let's see what that looks like when we execute that. So here we see what we have for the extra NTP servers. So these are the servers that shouldn't be configured. We took off the ones that should be configured from the output we retrieved from querying the device, and these are things that shouldn't be there. So now our playbook should basically go and remove these. So here in this debug statement, I basically say if this list is a blank list, the NTP servers are all configured correctly. Go down here. I'm going to skip those lines 35 through 38. Go ahead and get rid of the rest of my comments. So here we're going to remove our extra NTP servers. We use the iOS config module. We use our provider. Now notice what I do here. I loop over this variable. Each time I'm looping through it, I prepend a no space statement to it. I tested out what that was going to look like using this debugging, and then I'm going to execute this. Go ahead and execute this playbook. Now that output is hard to see. So here we can actually see we're removing some of our items. So we're removing our NTP servers. Now let me do this without the minus VVV. Actually, let me do my netmiko grep first and look at what exactly I have configured at this point in time. If that worked correctly, it should have removed the 2 NTP servers. And there you can see it did for PyNet router 1. And here you can see what it looks like for PyNet router 2. If I rerun this playbook, it should now have no extra NTP servers, and it should just give me this debugging message. The NTP servers are correct. There's nothing that needs to be removed. Now, let's step back for a second and talk about some of this at a high level. So, iOS facts, we're just checking connectivity. iOS config here, we're just making our initial config change. We then need some process for figuring out what is currently configured. And you have a few things in your toolbox here. You could use the Ansible core modules, or you could potentially use a napalm getter to try to retrieve what is currently configured on the device. Now, once we get that back to us, we then probably have this data structure problem, i.e., depending on how we retrieve this back, we need to get it into a usable form for us. So there's a few options that we have here. One of those is trying to use the Ansible filter operations directly in some way and trying to get exactly what we need back. Another potentially useful solution to this that we talked about earlier in the course is using an external Jinja 2 template and a lookup and converting or creating what we need to create, and then bringing that back into our playbook. So that's definitely another option for how do you take this information you gathered using the core modules or napalm getters and then get something usable. And in this case, what we need to get back is what are my extra NTP servers? And then ideally would be some way of actually removing the extra ones. Another possibility is just a notification, to flag you, hey, there's extra things here, so at least you know that your current configuration doesn't match exactly what it should match.